because we were living in a bubble where we didn't feel like anything like that could ever happen to us. And it happened on a clear blue day in early September, just out of nowhere. And that was what brought me back to government service. I took the very first job that I could find, doing anything that looked or smelled like going after the bad guys.
My guest today is lifelong public servant Don Yeske. Don is a military veteran turned federal agency leader, having served in roles across multiple branches and agencies and even deploying overseas to support combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most recently, Don was the director of the National Security Cyber Division at the Department of Homeland Security, where he led critical efforts like Zero Trust adoption.
There's an organization called SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. That organization repeatedly said, if there is a precipitous American withdrawal, this is what will happen. And you couldn't come to any other conclusion in the face of the facts that they had access to.
Unfortunately for us all, Don left the federal service earlier this year, and our conversation explores his decision and his growing concern for the social contract that underpins our national security.
In order for the law to underpin our basic social contract, we have to have faith that the law applies equally to everyone. I think that's changing, and I think it's under threat.
This was a thought-provoking and important conversation, one that, whether you agree with Don or not, is a conversation we need to have. And now, here's Don Yeske. For folks who don't know you, could you give us a background on yourself, who you are, what you've been up to?
Sure. Currently today, I work for a small company called Virtue that's doing really exciting things in data-centric security. 2 months ago, I chose to retire from the federal government. At that time, and for 2 years prior, I was the director of the National Security Cyber Division at DHS headquarters. In that role, my job involved, overseeing the NSS portfolio, the National Security Systems portfolio of DHS. Risk executive type work there. From a GRC perspective. I assume your audience is familiar with those terms.
Yeah, generally, but I have the acronym rule. I love, if you're going to use an acronym, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Sure. GRC is governance, risk, and compliance. So I was responsible, one of the three major teams that worked for me was responsible for governance, risk, and compliance for our national security systems. And national security systems in general are systems that are involved in intelligence, defense, or continuity of operations, continuity of government. There's a misnomer that they have to be classified. They don't. There are, and we designated several systems that are unclassified as national security systems during my time there. So that was about the last 2 years. And prior to that, I spent 15 years working for the Department of the Navy. Initially for NIWC Atlantic directly, leading projects for them, mostly for the United States Marine Corps. So I kind of built a career as a program and project manager, having been hired to be an engineer. So I had to learn on the job how to run defense integration,
which is a massively different skill set from engineering.
Not the same thing, but I had to learn it on the job, and I did. And so I led several what are called IPTs, integrated project teams, building mostly Marine Corps command and control and network operations and defense type systems. During my civilian career, I went overseas to conflict zones 3 times, spent 3.5 years, a full year in Western Iraq, and about 2.5 years in Afghanistan in 2 different stints in Helmand province in 2011.
Wow.
And in...
Is that surge time?
Well, it was certainly major combat operations. So the surge, if we think of the surge in Iraq, that actually happened in the latter half of my time there, late 2007 into early 2008. And that those forces that surged into Iraq came from Afghanistan. Or were drawn down from going to Afghanistan. So that created a condition in Afghanistan where we fell behind the power curve. And that led to, increased combat operations over there. But I was in Afghanistan twice. Once in 2011, I deployed with 2MEF, 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, Main Body 3. I was the Deputy Information Management Officer for the Marines there. And then in 2018, 2019 was my last deployment in Kabul. And I was privileged to lead the ICT advisory, IT and Communications Advisory Mission. ICT is the international term for IT, really. So in that role, I was directly advising my counterparts at the Ministry of Interior Affairs and the Ministry of Defense in Kabul on how to build and maintain proper IT and communications capabilities, how to build that capacity. After I came back from that deployment, I spent the next 4.5 years at the Pentagon. And the first couple of years at Headquarters C4, Headquarters Marine Corps, Command and Control, Communications and Computers. And that is essentially the CIO of the Marine Corps. And I was privileged to do some work there toward a thing called NetMod, Network Modernization, which was in line with the Commandant's Force Design 2030 initiative at the time. It was, how do you align all of the programs that are building this thing called the MCEN, Marine Corps Enterprise Network? 57 different programs, I think we figured out in the first version of the NetMod plan, spending north of $1 billion, close to $2 billion a year. And they hadn't previously been well coordinated. They all had their own little slice of the picture, but they weren't really coordinated to achieve an operational reality. And so that was great work done by Marines, supported by smart civilians like me. And in doing that work and other work for C4, I caught the attention of DON-CIO, the Department of the Navy CIO. The CTO at the time, Jane Rathbun, recruited me to come up there. And I think I came up in October 21 and stayed there through the end of my time with the Department of the Navy until June of 2023, moving over to DHS. In the last several months of that, I fleeted up to deputy CTO and then to the acting in the CTO capacity when I left.
For DHS?
No, for DON-CIO, for the Department of the Navy.
Before you went to DHS?
Before I went to DHS. Okay. Sorry, confusing.
There's a lot of movement because it's a storied career.
I've done a lot of things. That's fair. That's fair.
I have a number of different lines of questioning. I obviously want to get to why you left the government and the transition out of government. Summarizing, I think I could say career civil servant, and even prior military as well. So always a public servant.
That is true. I served in the Air Force. I got out of the Air Force in 1996, and I was well and truly done at that point. You probably would not have been able to convince me that I was going to go back to work for the government. And on 9/11, I worked for a small company called Stratus Technologies that built fault-tolerant computers. It's a niche thing. These are computers that you can rip out half of the memory and 2/3 of the storage, and they will just keep going. And the people logged into them won't notice. And to have a computer like that, you pay a premium not only for the hardware and the software, but also for the support. I worked in a support center in Phoenix, and I was doing level 3 support for those computers. And, we were a small company looking to IPO, getting ready to get rich. And, everybody, it's
the late 90s, great
it's
time.
The late 90s. Yeah. The .com bubble, right? We were all doing well, and people forget the .com bubble had just burst on 9/11. So we went from, hey, we're going to IPO to, hey, we're going to hold off for a while. And then 9/11 happened. Our customers at Stratus Technologies were some in government, like NASA was still flying the space shuttle at that time. So they had a Stratus computer on their watch floor. I think it was doing DNS for them. But our big customers were commercial. So think about some examples. United Airlines actually ran their reservation system on a Stratus computer at the time because they valued that level of availability, 5 nines of availability.
That's some wild resilience for the late 90s. Knowing what I know now, like seeing the 2010s and virtualization and hyper-converged infrastructure and all that, thinking about the challenge of resiliency in the late 90s.
How do you achieve that with that level of technology at that time? Yeah, it was impressive. It was really cool. But our biggest customers were financial. The people who lose millions of dollars if they're down for a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
4 out of 5 of the world's largest banks, NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, had Stratus computers. And they had gone from being bullish, and wanting more to delaying orders because the dot-com bubble had burst and the economy was in a downturn. And then 9/11 happened. We did have a few technicians in the World Trade Center. They got out, thankfully. But if, there are a lot of people probably listening right now who weren't alive at the time. And it's hard to appreciate how much of a turning point that was for the country, how different it made the world to us. Because we were living in a bubble where we didn't feel like anything like that could ever happen to us.
Yeah.
And it happened on a clear blue day in early September, just out of nowhere. And I was young, and I had been out of the Air Force for 5 or 6 years at this point, and I was pissed. And, we went from, we're going to go IPO and we're going to get rich to my entire division got laid off. I was laid off in January of 2002. And that was what brought me back to government service. I took the very first job that I could find doing anything that looked or smelled like going after the bad guys. And I went from making $85,000 a year to making $55,000.
$85K in 2002. That's good money.
It was good money, but I lost $30,000 a year in the transition, and moved all the way across the country to a place where I knew no one. The only thing I knew is that I would be building computers to go kill bad guys with. And that was the basis of my civilian career.
I want to stay on 9/11 for a minute. We've had a couple guests on the podcast where 9/11's talked about as like this turning point for people as people, like career changes because it, arose something within them. My own experience of 9/11, it's interesting to think back on now because we're 24 years removed.
Yeah.
Right. We're coming up on that 25, and it's such a moment in my own life. I was, a young teenager, grew up in the late 90s, very optimistic time, lots of technology and excitement, very hopeful. We certainly felt untouchable. I mean, I had heard the term terrorist as like something that happened to like the USS Cole, like overseas, like that doesn't happen here. And September 11th, just like any other day, totally changed everything for a kid, and just, I think back on that and in reflection, like it totally changed the world.
Yes, it did.
It changed for kids. It changed for adults. It changed for America. It's so tragic in retrospect to see like what the world was like before and now where we've ended up and how much damage and just so many bad things that have come out of all that. There's also a lot of good things. Careers have happened, and a lot of public servants were inspired to take action.
Definitely.
But I think we all just kind of think back on like, what a truly seismic shift in world history that was.
It cannot be overstated how much things changed that very day and how many lives were impacted, not just in the United States, but around the world. But at a personal level, it certainly changed everything for me, for my young family. I had 3 young children at that moment, and we were doing okay. And, their lives were happy and innocent, and, they had friends in school and community, and that just kind of got all uprooted in that moment because no, there are bad things in the world. And how do you explain to children who are very, very young what they've just seen?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It was traumatic for me, for my wife, for my children. And that just contributed to years and years on my part of anger. I held on to that anger for more than a decade, I think. Over time, it morphed. And by the time I left DHS, although, the circumstances being what they were was not ideal, but I was grateful to spend the last 2 years of my career at the department that was created as a direct result of 9/11.
It's kind of like coming full circle.
Yeah. It felt like finishing a long journey.
That I haven't really talked to my parents ever about their experience, but man, that must have been really challenging having kids of my own now, trying to explain that. And there was no filter. Like, we were in school when all this happened. And I think the entire country turned on TVs.
Yes.
And my teachers were speechless. I mean, it was just, we were watching this horrific thing. And I remember just a blur of the rest of that day, going home early, just watching the towers fall. And I remember going to school the next day, and it was just like, no one knew what to say, what to do about the fact that all these young kids saw that. And not to belabor the point, but like, it wasn't just change in terms of how the national security apparatus shifted. There's like cultural elements I think are directly attributed to 9/11 in media, in like popular media, TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
Everything has gotten like this gritty darkness to it. Like Game of Thrones became the biggest TV show ever. And it's largely because it's got like this gritty realism. And that's like the thing now. Everything's all gritty and real and dark. And it's almost like before that, it was very whimsical. There was a lot of fantasy, high fantasy, fun stuff, and everything became dystopian, youth novels and shows, dystopian, end of the world, Armageddon type stuff. Like, I wonder if that is why that shift happened, because it's in our psyche.
There's probably good historical evidence that dystopian tales, take root and are told in societies that are going through big changes like this. What are the big dystopian novels that we could put our fingers on, right? 1984.
Yeah.
Right. Or Brave New World, right? Aldous Huxley,
yeah.
Right? These are novels that were written, in a time of global war, right? In and around the time of World War I, World War II, right? The Great Depression here in America, things that seemed, and I'm sure were for many people, apocalyptic, right? And maybe it's our way as human beings of trying to process that is we tell stories. Those are stories, of course, with a point. And that point had to do with the politics of the time, which unfortunately resonate very well today, about power and the way that power is pursued and acquired, particularly by people, who will do anything toward that end.
I watched a video recently, Mark Barron, who's like a massive podcaster and author. He had this video that popped up on my feed, and for whatever reason, the algorithm fed it to me at the right time. And the content or the title was, why are all the all the worst people having the best lives? Like, why are all the worst people accumulating power? Like, what is going on where these people who don't seem to care about the rest of us are the ones accumulating power? Which there are certainly people in power in high positions who aren't that, but certainly feels like the majority are people that we don't want in those positions.
I would agree that there are people in power right now who are in power for unscrupulous, self-serving reasons, and who are not good examples of what we would want of our leaders in the United States of America. That's certainly true. I'll stop short of criticizing anyone by name in particular, but it's fairly evident. Turn on the news every night, and you can see evidence of people pursuing obviously personal agendas, right? And obvious naked power grabs and obvious lies being told just at scale. It is, the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot recently, but that's because a lot of things that have never happened before or haven't happened before in living memory are happening right now.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say a dark time, but there's definitely challenges, and norms seem to have no normalcy anymore.
Right.
Like I'm finding out there's so many rules we thought were rules that are not rules. And it's shocking sometimes to think how little resistance to those breaking the normalcy. Like, it's just happening. It's all just happening in real time. And there's never been a moment where I feel like the light's been switched, but it's getting, darker in the room.
It is. That's true. I think we have to see these things in a personal way. Everyone responds to their own needs first, right? There's sort of Maslow's hierarchy, right? You have at the base of that construct, food, water, shelter, safety, right? And way up at the top, self-actualization, right? The sort of highest
Purpose,
ideals.
meaning.
Yeah. Think about the things that are happening, not just in America, but around the world right now in the name of populism, and what those things are doing to the elements of Maslow's hierarchy, right? If you're a federal employee right now, there is not a federal employee who has not been shaken at the base of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Your ability to earn a living, your ability to provide a home for your family, your ability to have, water, shelter, and clothing, and the basic things that make life possible. When that is threatened, it doesn't matter what else you have.
Right.
It doesn't matter what meaning you might derive from the things that you do. And I would tell you that federal employees en masse derive great meaning from their work. There are people who do work that typically does not pay as much as the same work would pay in the private sector. They don't get the type of acclaim and, other rewards that people might get for doing similar things. Certainly government lawyers are not paid anything like lawyers in the private sector, as a big glaring example. So why would you go and be a lawyer for the U.S. government? Why would you go to work for the Department of Justice, as an example? It's not to make money, right? It's about the meaning and the mission and the ability to impact things and make a difference. And, all of that rests on a social contract, and underwriting that social contract, that idea of basic safety, is rule of law.
Yeah.
And here in this country, you can have a conversation that includes the words rule of law right now pretty easily. And those words don't really mean to Americans what they mean to people who have been in parts of the world where rule of law is not in place. Right. In Afghanistan in 2011 in Helmand province, there was not rule of law. What was there? Well, your social contract in a circumstance like that doesn't work the same way. When I got into my car to come here, what gave me confidence that if I drove on the correct side of the road and, obeyed traffic laws and stopped at stoplights and stop signs and turned in turn-only lanes, what gave me confidence that I would arrive here alive?
That everyone else had to pass the same tests and have the license, and their car had to be inspected, and the roads had to be treated and all that.
Which is all underwritten by the law, right? A basic belief that I'm obeying the law. Broadly, other people are obeying the law. We made the law for a reason. If someone violates the law, they will be held accountable for that in some way. It does happen, but we have faith when we go out of our homes and get into our cars and drive somewhere that the system around us, underwritten by the law, keeps us safe.
You think that's changing?
I think that's changing. And I think it's under threat. And the thing that places it under duress is, in order for the law to underpin our basic social contract, we have to have faith that the law applies equally to everyone. We see direct evidence on the news every night that the law does not apply equally to everyone. This week, as we're having this discussion, a career prosecutor was pushed out at the Department of Justice for coming to the conclusion, I have to assume rightly, that there was not sufficient evidence to indict James Comey and pursue him in a criminal proceeding for a crime. And that person was pushed out, and they were replaced by someone who is an insurance attorney, as I understand it, who has no prosecutorial experience, and who returned an indictment to James Comey within, I think, 2 days.
And a clear direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Why? Because they were told. Not privately, in public.
Yeah.
Right? Over social media. Go indict James Comey.
Right.
The law doesn't apply equally to everyone when that's how the law works.
And whether or not people personally believe that James Comey did something that needs to, he needs to have a fair and speedy trial and all that, but everyone should be alarmed at the way that was done.
Exactly. I'm not talking about whether or not you believe James Comey said anything wrong. I'm not talking, and actually there's evidence that some of the things that he said, before Congress to the Senate, later, were determined not to be correct. Okay. So you can have a rational discussion about whether or not you believe James Comey committed a crime. The way that this action was taken is what I'm talking about, right? In Southwest Afghanistan in 2011, there were laws. Did anyone believe that those laws would keep them safe? Did they have the same level of faith that the law would keep them safe? Obviously not.
Right.
And it's easy to kind of, from afar look down on people who, live in a world like that for, kowtowing to the local warlord. But why would you do that? Because they actually fulfill the same function that the law fulfills for us. When you have a dispute with your neighbor and, my neighbor took half of my field, you don't go to the law, you go to the Taliban, right?
Right.
And it turns out, in more cases than not, actually do something about it. So for those people who are living in that condition, in that moment, in that place, that's their social contract. What would we say is our social contract? Is it different now than it was a year ago? If your access to justice is determined by your fealty to a person, the answer is our social contract is changing. And our social contract is underwritten by the rule of law.
Yeah. As personally, I'm a great admirer of the founders. I love that historical time period. I've read so many of their writings, from Hamilton to Jefferson to Washington, Adams, all of them. And I think people forget, like, the core concept really in America in the founding was a rule of law and a protection of individuals' freedom of speech and freedom of religion and all that through enforcement of the law fairly and equally. Obviously, America is not without its terrible side of its history, but as a concept and as the experiment that was, I think you're right. The social contract underpinning everything is that upholding of the law.
The idea that no one is above the law. That's one of the things that ties us all together as Americans. And if we're willing to sacrifice that, then a reasonable question is, what are we not willing to sacrifice? If your line's not there, where is it?
It's dark times potentially. I mean, and under threat, I think is the right word. I want to go back to something you said that something that I've said and others have said on this podcast that I think is just always worth repeating. We've had folks who have been career public servants in federal agencies and everything else. And I've had the privilege to meet and talk to so many of them now in a public setting on the podcast, but also I've met so many privately. Mm-hmm. And in my private life, I don't have a lot of friends that are in this world. I have a lot of friends who are just, getting by in their daily lives. And there's like this American perception, this public perception of people in the federal apparatus or in the government apparatus. The stereotypes, the sit on their butt, just collecting a check, not doing anything. And I always try to tell people, like, my lived experience is every single one of them I've met is at least properly motivated by the mission. They truly care. They're not just there to, take advantage. They sacrifice other opportunities they would have in the private sector, monetary, lifestyle, wearing a t-shirt, for having to go into the Pentagon and do the important mission, go into a skiff to do the important mission. Universally, that's kind of been my experience. And I think it's worth repeating. We have incredible people in our federal apparatus who care about doing the right thing for their fellow citizens.
I wish more people saw that. If we'd had this conversation 3 months ago, first off, I wouldn't have been able to have this conversation 3 months ago, but
True.
beyond that, I was operating under a different set of rules. I had to wait for about an hour to have this conversation. You guys bought me lunch during that hour. Thank you very much. I would not have been able to accept lunch 3 months ago. Why? Because Title 18 United States Code is criminal law. And many of the ethics standards that apply to federal employees are rooted in Title 18 United States Code. There are guidelines, there are rules. It's not necessarily the fact that you would have been prosecuted for accepting a lunch that cost more than $20 and, or accepting any gifts beyond, I think, $20 or $25 in 1 year, right? But what people don't see when they kind of look at the federal government from the outside and don't know anything about that is, for example, every year of my federal career, I filed a financial disclosure. Every single year. And, I had to disclose if I had, stock in some particular company, if I had an old 401k someplace, if I had a direct family member employed by some company that would have business before the agency where I worked. We actually police this stuff. And you don't see it getting policed because praise is public and correction is private. And it doesn't work to our favor to do that in private, but we do it in private. It's generally not seen when someone gets corrected to the point of losing their jobs, potentially going to prison for violating one of these, core principles of the civil service, right? That exist, by the way, for a reason.
Right.
We forget that it used to be the case that the civil service was political. It used to be the case that civil servants got their jobs through fealty to a political candidate. The last time that was true, the president was shot by a person who was disgruntled because they weren't given a job in government after that president was elected. Like, that happened.
Which president was that? McKinley?
I want to say yes. I wasn't actually quoting which president it was because I've forgotten. It's
been a couple of them.
It was just around 100 years ago, and I'm sure I'll look it up after this conversation, and I'll be ashamed of myself for not remembering. But yeah, a newly elected president was shot by someone seeking public office as a reward for political fealty and for what they portrayed as help getting elected, right? So the reform of the civil service that goes back 100 years is actually rooted in that. And, oh, by the way, at that time, you could not count on the federal government doing anything well or correctly or right? And you had no real recourse if they didn't, right? There was no guarantee that whoever it was that was, running imports and exports out of New York City actually knew what the hell they were doing.
Right.
Or didn't have a personal and financial interest in doing it a certain
skimming a
way.
little bit off the top.
Exactly. Yeah. There was no reasonable assurance of that. In fact, the people who were selected to go do those jobs, those were desirable jobs because you could take advantage of the system, because you could monetize it and skim off the top. Are there ways that people who have worked in government monetize that? I mean, even now, yes. Right. I think there's a valid criticism of a sort of revolving door.
Yeah, there's a pipeline.
Particularly at very high levels of both industry and government. And yeah, that exists. I'm not and was never a political appointee. So I'm not a part of that system. I can criticize it along with you, but 99% of civil servants don't fall into that category.
Right.
We're not political appointees. We're just people. We're just people who do a job because at some point in our lives, we proved that we knew how to do that job. We didn't say we knew how to do that job. We actually proved it. When I went to work for DHS, I was part of something called the Cyber Talent Management System. And it is a new personnel system. The way that it works is you apply for a job and you declare what's called a primary technical capacity or technical competency. And then you take several tests. And I sat for one of these tests, and it's no different than, going and sitting for your CISSP or any sort of major certification, right? It's administered by a third party at a testing site. And so you have to prove, if you say that you know cybersecurity architecture, you have to go prove that you know cybersecurity architecture. If you say that you know program management, you have to go take a test on that. And I did. And I said I knew GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And I went and took a test on it, and then I interviewed with a computer, and 3 people who did not know me rated my answers, so that you have that human element of, not only did I prove to a computer that I knew what I was talking about, but 3 different humans who don't know me said, yeah, this person seems to know what the hell they're talking about. And under CTMS, that determines what you get paid. It's not exactly how it works everywhere in government, but it's based on that. I think it's a better implementation of that. It works faster. And it was specifically and solely designed for DHS, but it's a model for how hiring should work in the federal government. And even where it doesn't work that way, it is competency based.
Right. Unbiased evaluation of competency.
At some point through some process to some person, you had to prove you knew what the hell you were doing. And, those are all things that people who, sit back and criticize the government as inept and corrupt don't see and don't understand and will never see.
Yeah. Well, also you hear that criticism of, incompetence or ineffective or inefficient, which I always kind of laugh at because I'm like, have you ever worked at a large company?
Yes. Bureaucracy exists at any organization beyond, I think, 150 people? You can't have direct relationships with more than 150 people.
Right. Any large institution of human beings is going to have challenges. Will there be fraud? Yes. Will there be waste? Yes. Yeah. Will there be abuse? Always. We're dealing with human beings.
Well, yeah. And, the recent crusade against fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government under DOGE, may have been, I will give them credit, may have been motivated by real belief that there was rampant fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. It's also the case that many of the people who came into the departments and agencies from DOGE and went looking for that fraud, waste, and abuse not only didn't find it, but are now working for those departments and agencies, having now learned how they work, and it was never a viable strategy to go save money in the federal budget by hiring and firing people, by hiring a few people to fire a lot of people en masse. That was never a viable strategy. About 3% of the federal budget is labor, workforce, what we pay federal employees. If you fired all of them, you'd still spend 97 cents out of every dollar in the federal budget. So we were never going to save $2 trillion or $1 trillion or any $1 trillion by firing a bunch of people. And when it started, we were understaffed.
Right.
Anyone would have told you. In cybersecurity, especially, we were understaffed. We did not have enough people. And, I don't know how to offer you objective evidence of that. I can just tell you that it's true.
I think it's true across everything. We talk on our podcast. We have all kinds of people come in from all, private industry and national, federal agencies. And we've had local utility folks. Everyone's telling the story of hey, the cyber domain is the current warfare domain that we're operating in day in and day out. And our adversaries are getting more capable. They're more complex. They're more sophisticated than ever. We're not doing enough. Everyone involved will tell that story.
There's so much evidence of that. Salt Typhoon, you know, there's not an American who was not impacted by Salt Typhoon. Right. I think on your first episode with Andy McCabe, he talked about adversaries prepositioning assets in critical infrastructure, right, in advance of warfare, kinetic warfare.
Right. It's just a great asset for them to have.
Yeah.
To turn screws on us.
And what do we now know? They were sitting in our telecom networks, undetected for years. And this is all open source. I'm not telling you anything that's classified, but open source reporting, which we have every reason to believe is correct, would tell you that the Chinese regime positioned a lot of assets and people inside of our telecom networks, and that they were actively spying on senior leaders inside of our government through those networks. Like, that happened.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not hyperbole. We know it's happening. Right.
And the stakes are high because they're, again, monitoring the highest levels. And this is our largest global adversary who has demonstrated time and again that they've earned the title adversary.
Yeah. Yeah. At least, I think we used to call them a strategic competitor, and they are a strategic competitor. I hope we get back to that rhetoric here. But yeah, they've earned the title adversary through their actions.
So you came to my attention, and I apologize, I'm going to pull up your LinkedIn.
Go ahead.
But you came to my attention on LinkedIn because you made a post, and I guess someone I know commented or liked it or whatever else. But I wanted to read a little bit to you as context for where I'm going to go with the conversation. It was about 2 months ago. You said, if anyone had asked me 6 months ago, so 8 months ago now, I'd have said that I intended for DHS to be the final stop in my career as a civil servant. Turns out I was right. I just didn't count on being right so soon. What changed? What happened?
It's important to understand what's being done to the federal workforce right now. We talked earlier about how there's a general perception of federal employees as inept and lazy and corrupt, and of federal agencies as inefficient and, ineffective, and why that perception exists. That perception allows weaponization and has been weaponized by the current administration. It's not hyperbole to say that it's intentional, right? The current director of the OMB is on record stating that the intention was to cause trauma, to put federal employees in trauma. It worked. The actions that have been taken throughout government, throughout the federal government, have traumatized the federal workforce. So that changed. We went from being revered and respected by our leaders to being reviled by our leaders and treated like criminals. And that, I think there was a very calculated set of actions that was being taken to ensure that trauma never wore off. I'm a human being who's gone to war 3 times. I know something about surviving in high stress situations and even thriving in them. You can adapt to almost anything that is done to you. And you do adapt to it in a period of a week or two. Living in a war zone can go from being really disconcerting to being your normal day. The way that these actions were taken, drip, 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 right? And they were spaced out every few weeks, was intentional. I'm convinced that was intentional, and it was designed to keep that trauma, to keep that pressure coming.
Just keep that wound fresh.
Yeah. Keep cutting it open a little bit more, every couple of weeks. Not everyone is as resilient as everyone else. We lost a lot of good people in the early days, I think, just from, this is upending my relationships with my family and my ability to live in my community and do the things that I love. And, it's bad for my mental health and I have to step back, right? We lost a lot of people that way. And there were even people outside of government who cheered that, and that's just disgusting to me. These people who are heroes, who have sacrificed of themselves and time with their family, to serve you, you're now cheering when their livelihood is ripped out from under them, right? When they no longer have the ability to earn a living and have a roof over their heads and put food on their table. That's disgusting to me. So that happened, but it's not why I left. I survived that. What I was doing at DHS, responsibility for the national security systems portfolio at DHS, leading zero trust implementation at DHS, that was not going to end. That, I had every expectation on the day that I turned in my resignation. I had every expectation that I would continue either in that role or in some other role related to it within DHS for as long as I chose to remain. That was the problem. The problem was that they wouldn't send me home. I had to come to terms with the fact that my leadership is under the same stress as I am. And those stresses that hit right at the base of Maslow's hierarchy will cause you to do things that otherwise you would never do.
Right.
And it was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when an unlawful order would be presented. When is the day that you're going to be told to go do something that you don't think is in direct contravention of the law in order to satisfy a political whim, an old grudge, something.
Right.
And given what DHS does, and by the way, I remain fully committed to that mission. I think the mission itself, the actions being taken by the department right now do not reflect, honestly, that mission. But I could have continued to work there and not agreed with the actions being taken. I've worked for presidents, administrations of both parties. I worked for the first Trump administration, for crying out loud. Through the years that I've worked for the federal government, there have been liberal agendas, there have been conservative agendas. And by the way, the federal workforce spans the ideological spectrum. There are people who are federal employees and my employees at the Department of Homeland Security who voted for the current administration and people who definitely did not. They were working side by side, doing great work for the American people because their job wasn't to, kowtow to a nakedly personal and political agenda. Their job was to do important things like make sure that our communications inside the department remain secure. It turns out that Republicans and Democrats have similar needs for security. And so it's not, I want to be very clear. This is not a left or right thing. This is not a liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat thing. I left because the levers of power inside the federal government are being misused. And it was not a matter of if I would be involved in that. It was a matter of when. And I felt like, playing out that scenario, I had two choices. I could wait for it to happen, at which point I would do the only honorable thing I could do and refuse to obey the order and resign. And probably do so in a way that would have raised a lot of awareness to that. Nobody wins in that scenario. The other way it could play out is I self-select out, and I chose to remove myself from that equation rather than see where it ended.
So I think that's a very, I'll use the term morally informed decision, right? And those are the kinds of, that's the kind of decision-making process we want our public servants to take. Like we want public servants who take the morality of their actions seriously, and approach it intellectually and are again, motivated to do the right thing. And I don't think this is a unique story. I've talked to a number of people who have left government. I've talked to people who are still in government, and almost everyone I've talked to feels the same. And we're, it's going to be so hard not to make this political, or for people to read the politics of it and think like we're bashing a particular political side or something like that.
It's not about that.
It's not. Yeah. And that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is the apparatus that the federal government pursues. Like DHS's mission matters. It's important. It protects our daily lives. it was, as you said, created in the aftermath of the largest, most impactful terrorist attack that's ever occurred on our soil.
Which hasn't happened again.
Right. That mission matters, and the people that flocked to that mission were driven by the right reasons, the right motivations, are morally informed and are, thinking about things the way we want and making personal sacrifice to do so. So many of them are being ousted.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've just sort of described the workforce in general. I think there's some level of misunderstanding that the people who are being driven out are ideologically of one sect or another. They're not. They're people who got caught up in the grinding gears of the machine, that at some point had to, relent to the fact that I have a family to provide for. I have moral obligations to this country. I also have moral obligations to my family.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'll go ahead and share this. I wasn't planning on it, but I'll go ahead and share this. I am several weeks away from donating a kidney for my sister. I've been in the process of preparing to do that for more than a year. And a year ago, I weighed 319 pounds. I had to lose a bunch of weight. It's one of the, sort of conditions of donating an organ is that you are otherwise in good health. And you have to be below a certain body mass index to have that surgery performed, because it's voluntary, right? It's not something a doctor is doing because you need it and you'll die without it. It's something a doctor is doing because you're saying, I'm willing to do it. And so the medical standards for a donor are actually very high. So I've had to go through every kind of medical test in the last year that there is to show that I'm in good enough health and in a sound state of mind to make the choice to donate an organ. And part of that was losing a significant amount of weight. Weight loss is predicated on things. Among the things it's predicated upon are the ability to sleep at night, your level of stress, your intake of alcohol. I lost 40 pounds of the 50 pounds I've lost in a year by February. And starting in February, to the point where I resigned from the federal government, I didn't lose any weight. I didn't gain any weight. My doctors were working with me. And, I actually started a GLP-1 treatment several months into that phase because I was worried I would gain weight and I would go over the weight threshold for the surgery. And one of the big things in my mind when I made the decision to leave was that it was, I can emotionally, I can just, gut it out. I can just kind of deal with it. But I'm also making a choice that's putting my sister's life at risk. That kind of human impact. That's what people don't see when they stand on the sidelines and they cheer at people being placed as the head of OMB literally said, in trauma.
Right. That's immediately where my head went. It's like, first of all, incredibly noble. And I know you don't need to be told that, but what an incredibly noble thing to do for somebody that you love.
Thank you. I mean, I don't feel like that, but I appreciate the thought. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, everyone reasonable from the outside perspective would say like, that's a significant decision, a tough one. And the work to enable that is huge. And I just go back to what a miss or what a disservice to people that would do something like that with that sort of motivation, that someone maliciously wants to go out of their way to traumatize you and people like you.
There is no, well, I appreciate that. I guess I would say there is no group of human beings that we should want to go traumatize broadly,
Right.
Even people who've done terrible things, like, should we want to go traumatize those people? I don't know, but I see certain moral problems with that.
Yeah, it appeals to our baser primitive
Instincts.
nature, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes that can be so hard to look at because you're like, man, I really thought we were above this.
We struggle. We as human beings struggle. We have basic instincts that drive us toward fear and aggression. I'm heartened, though, by the fact that the one instinct that we have that is more powerful than that one is our instinct to love each other. The only thing that gets more attention on the internet than some video that provokes your ire, right? Pisses you off, right? Somebody being a really terrible driver and then getting immediate karma and you're like, yes.
Yeah.
Divine
justice.
Yeah. Like that will get attention. That will get clicks. That will get likes, right? That will get people's attention. You know what is the only thing that will get more?
Cat videos.
Kitten, a puppy, a baby, right? It's a dad coming home to a child and surprising them at their school who's been on deployment for a year, right? That stuff is more powerful than the fear and the hate. And right now in this country, our politics are defined by fear and hate. And I think the way out of that is to embrace the one thing that is more powerful than that. How did Barack Obama get elected in 2008? Hope and change, right?
That was the message.
It was a positive message. It was a positive message that it reverberated, right? It got people's attention. It changed the politics of the moment. I think if there's a way through this thicket that we're in, it's that. We have to, again, federal employees come from all across the political spectrum, but Americans come from all across the political spectrum. And we're being divided. We're being told that the people on the other side of the aisle from you are like evil and subhuman and these crazy things.
Terribly motivated.
Yeah. And I mean, I have family members who are diametrically opposed to me politically. And I love them dearly. And we're still able to have conversations. And the reason why is because under the surface of all of that politics is our ability to talk and listen, right? Our ability to relate to each other. If we don't find a way as a country to start listening to each other again and having stronger relationships then can be torn apart by the methods that are being used now to do that, I don't know how we get through this.
Yeah. Well, I think a big thing is conversation. I have my own personal politics, and I have family members who we couldn't be further from each other.
Yeah.
But they're some of my closest family members. Do we get to energize debates and argument? Yeah,
Of course.
but we still see each other and we still talk about it. And then, we have a mature, for the most part, sometimes it gets immature, but we're human. For the most part, a mature understanding, like, hey, we have our beliefs. They are what they are. And, we're going to agree to disagree on a lot. But the one thing we're not going to disagree on is that both of our perspectives have value and both of our lives have value. And, this is just politics. It's just
The things that divide us tend to be very small, right?
Yeah.
And that was, I think, the really great thing about working at DHS and before that working at DOD and, was that the people there, they come from all over the place politically, but they're bound together by their belief in the mission and their faith in each other. Their faith in each other. We've got to find a way to bottle that and sell it,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned my first episode with Andy McCabe,
Yeah.
who has become a politicized figure, but he set the right tone, I think, for our podcast and some of what he said, and he painted this picture of the workforce that he was, the way he described it, privileged to lead, and he was daily inspired. His optimism was largely rooted in that. And I'll give you a preview to the end of the podcast. I always ask the same thing. The last topic is always, what keeps you optimistic? Because we deal in pessimistic things. And that was where we set that tradition, was having that first bit of conversation, like, man, there's a lot going on, but what keeps you optimistic? I want to say at least, half the time when that conversation comes up, the guest that I'm talking to, it's something like that. It's the people that I've worked with. It's the people I know who are in these institutions, private or public, who are doing their job every day, motivated. Yes, they have to feed their families, but they can feed their families many ways. They're motivated by the mission. They care. And like we said earlier, I think people are too dismissive of that and too quick to assume other things.
Yeah. Not to spoil the ending of your podcast, but that's my answer. I am inspired by people. I have faith in people. That word faith, that gets thrown around a lot, and I think misdefined.
Yeah.
Sometimes people say faith and they mean like meritless belief, right? I have faith in something, and what they're actually saying is, I believe in something in spite of every reason not to believe it. That's not actually what the word faith, even in a religious context, actually means. Faith is earned belief. Faith is belief based on evidence, based on some reason, based on a natural and logical conclusion to a series of unknown things, right? The first time you got on an airplane, you had faith that airplane would take off and fly through the air.
Yeah.
Despite some very good reasons not to believe that. The fact that it happens every day, the fact that, maybe that you understand the aerodynamic principles here or the engineering principles behind, aircraft or whatever. You had a reason to have faith that plane would take off, right? I have faith in us. I have faith in people. And that is what gives me hope. I have faith in the basic good nature of neighbors, and the propensity of neighbors under the worst circumstances to come out and take care of each other.
Yeah.
We're going to do that. That's who we are. And yeah, a lot of methods and a lot of tools and a lot of underhanded techniques are going to be applied by unscrupulous people trying to divide us. In the end, I have faith in people.
Yeah. I like the way you ground that, and like that's earned,
Yeah.
My other career I talk about on the podcast sometimes is I'm a paramedic. So I've been in the fire and EMS world about as long as I've been doing IT, kind of bounced between them for a while before I sort of settled on this as a career. So I've largely done it as a volunteer, which means I've been part of volunteer organizations of people who become trained to deal with emergencies on their own time, away from their families. And I've met so many unique people in that world on all extremes of political spectrums and center and everything else. But what unifies us is when those, the tones drop and you go out for a call, everyone's on the mission together.
Yep.
People I'm so politically against, we've worked on the same auto accident or whatever, and we're motivated like, hey, there's a person in need of our help. We're trained to do it. We're going to provide it.
And that is 1,000 times in that moment more powerful.
Hugely.
Right? Yeah. Than whatever your belief system or your politics might be. Yeah, absolutely. In the military, it's the same. The military is a cross section of the country, and so they also represent a wide variety of beliefs and opinions in politics. But none of that matters when you're actually in an operation, when you're actually performing a mission. What matters is the mission, and what matters is that soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine next to you.
Yeah. I think it's a good segue into, there's so many areas we can go with this conversation.
Yeah. Sorry, I've gotten off track.
No. This is great. And I think it's an important conversation that, transcends my little podcast here. I think people should be concerned, whatever side of the political aisle you're on.
Absolutely.
Well-motivated, mission-oriented, morally sound people are leaving the federal apparatus that serves you and protects us against things like another 9/11. We should all be concerned that level of talent is leaving that. And I know Virtue is a great company.
Yeah.
And I'm glad they have your talent, but I'll tell you what, I kind of wish you were still at DHS.
Well, there's a big part of me that does too. I struggled with the decision to leave. And until the morning I actually turned in my package to go on deferred resignation and retire, I didn't know if that is what I would do. I really did not want to give up my career.
I'm sure.
I have another 10, 15 years in me. I've got a third act in me. And I'd only been at DHS for 2 years, and it is hugely exciting, the work that DHS is doing. Groundbreaking stuff that I was involved in, particularly in cybersecurity and zero trust. I was excited to lead that. I was privileged to lead that and work with those people, and I wanted to keep doing that. Really wanted to keep doing that. And I tried to find a justification for doing it. And like I said, it comes down to things are going to continue in the vein that they currently are. And, the rounds are going to keep flying. Quick story. When I was in Iraq in 2007, I worked with a gunnery sergeant who had just come back from this experience where he was, I was working on BFT, Blue Force Tracking Systems. And we were doing logistics and repair for these things. And this Marine told me a story of him and a field grade Marine officer who had just been assigned to what were called at that time a police transition team, a PIT team. And they were out in Habbaniyah, which was the town right next to the base we were on. The day that they arrived, and these are, by the way, our capacity building has come a long way from that. Just sending 2 random Marines who had no particular background in law enforcement to go teach random Iraqis to enforce law, right? Like, it was never a good strategy to start, but at least we were trying, we were trying. This captain or major and gunny arrived at this police station out in Habbaniyah, which was basically a heavily armored postage stamp on a corner. And it was surrounded by HESCO barriers. If you're not familiar, a HESCO barrier is a bag of dirt and rocks. It's a burlap sack with a metal cage, and you use a backhoe and you fill it up with dirt, and it's bulletproof. It'll protect you from bullets and shrapnel. And so it's this little building surrounded by HESCO barriers. It's got a guard tower. It's got guys stationed on the roof of this little building. They pull into this compound and they're getting out of their Humvee, because we didn't have, at the beginning of 2007, we did not have MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. We're not there yet. So they're getting out of their up-armored Humvee and they're sort of starting to transition. Apparently someone walking by on the street, and this was not unusual, had an SKS, an old, Russian rifle slung over their shoulder, took it off and took a pot shot at a camera or a light or something near that compound. Single bullet. All hell broke loose. The guard tower with all of its armaments just started spraying at anyone and everything. The guys on the roof, because the guys in the guard tower were spraying at everyone and everything, started spraying at everyone and anything. And to hear the gunny tell it, like an impossible, like clown car number of people came out of this tiny little building and they started firing, so there's just bullets flying everywhere. In that moment, ostensibly their job was to say, hey, this is not right. You're overreacting. You've just expended a month's worth of ammunition. And, oh, by the way, terrorized the civilian population that you're here to serve and protect.
Yeah.
Everything about it was wrong. Everything about what was happening in that moment was wrong. And it was their job, ostensibly, to put a stop to it. What did they do? They hunkered down between the Humvee and the HESCO barrier, and they covered their heads. And they waited for the brass to stop flying. That is this moment in the federal government. Everything happening around us is wrong. And I do not fault anyone for not standing up and shouting, this is wrong, in that moment, because you're going to get killed.
Right.
If you do it. This is an administration that has shown a willingness and ability and proclivity to go after its political adversaries, like I'm taking a risk having this conversation with you. I suppose it's worthwhile. I'll probably question that judgment. Should something
we'll do what we can to help you not question that.
Should something bad happen, but, and again, it's not about left or right. It's not about, it's not about Republican or Democrat. Right and wrong.
Yeah.
There are things that are happening right now that are wrong. And I'm heartened, by the way, to see things like Ted Cruz standing up and saying, hey, we still have a First Amendment. And if we start trotting it against our enemies, we're going to regret that when they do it to us.
Yeah.
I'm heartened by things like that, that remind me that, no, there are larger principles here and people in power who understand them. And it's going to be hard, though. It's going to be hard moving on from this moment. But for right now, the best we can do, the best anyone can do who's in government or freshly out of government, a recovering government employee like myself, put your head down and try not to get killed.
Yeah, it's definitely a test. It's a test of principles of, go back to what we talked about earlier, like the core mission, the core social contract. It's a test of that.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, I want to know and understand more about what your job was in a war zone. Because as the public sees American forces, we see infantry, we see special forces, Navy SEALs, we see guys going to engage with the bad guy, and we just don't think about all of the apparatus that gets those guys there and gets them fed and sheltered and protected and all that sort of stuff to go do that. What were your roles?
In Iraq, mainly logistics. I was building and maintaining a supply chain for a system that had been deployed more rapidly than it should have been, which was a lot of things back then. We were reacting.
Yeah.
Our acquisition capabilities, and our processes and our policies demand that we do things like have spare parts for things, and figure out how to maintain them and who's going to do that job. We fielded Blue Force tracking without really having that. And so there was an army of contractors out there who their whole job was to turn wrenches. And they were probably wrenches that soldiers and Marines ought to be turning, but they weren't, because we hadn't taken the time to actually build up the technical expertise and the supply chain to support that very critical system, which it was in that moment critical. It was the only way that you could communicate beyond line of sight outside the wire. It was the only system that worked. So hugely important.
Right, if I understand correctly, we're talking about systems to know this unit's over here, there's this activity going on over here, like coordinating in the theater.
Blue Force tracking is a command and control system that was predominantly installed in vehicles. There were a few, what they called TOC kits. The Army has a term, TOC, Tactical Operations Center. The Marine Corps version of that was called the Combat Operations Center. But the TOC kits were stationary and inside of a tent or something. But most of the Blue Force tracking systems were integrated into vehicles. In fact, we kind of figured out how to integrate them into MRAPs when the first MRAP showed up, because no one had done that. And we had all the parts, and we just sort of, I literally built a rack out of scrap metal and, strung together multiple cables and, made it work. That was our job. That was the job that I did in 2007, make it work. And it wasn't just Blue Force tracking. I was on a site that was called the Special Equipment Item Cell, because we didn't have another name for it. And it was where Marines put things that had no real support. At the time, Chameleon, which was our electronic warfare system, the thing that prevented things from getting blown up by a cell signal as they're driving down the road. Gyrocam, which was it's a camera. It's a camera system that was on vehicles. There were some that were stationary. Blue Force tracking, anything, laser dazzlers. We were fielding these little laser dazzlers that sat underneath your M4, and you would use them as a escalation of force, right? I'm going to shout at you to stop. Then I'm going to dazzle you, and then I'm going to fire. They came up with that in theater. No one thought of it before the stuff actually arrived. We were moving with such speed that we were sending stuff into theater without any real idea of whether it would work, how it would work, or who was going to keep it working. So that's what I was doing in 2007. In 2011, I was very privileged to be a deputy principal staff officer at the MEF level. So an information management officer is responsible in Marine Corps vernacular, is responsible for basically everything that the G6 doesn't do. The G6 is responsible for the network. So they get the bits and bytes where they're going. The IMO takes over from there. And their job is to get the right information to the right place, the right time, and the right format to take an action or make a decision. That's what an IMO does. So we were responsible for basically the application layer, right? How do command and control systems actually talk to each other? Do they continue to work? Do they integrate? Do they integrate with foreign systems? Because we had, a coalition out there.
Right.
It wasn't just
NATO.
Americans, right? So that's what I was doing in 2011. 2018 and 19, totally different. I was in Kabul, and I went there under a program called the Ministry of Defense Advisors program, the MODA program. It's administered by the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. And what they do, and they still do this, is they recruit experts who are civil servants, mainly out of DOD, whatever we're calling it now, the Department of War, but from anywhere, who have technical expertise in a field that goes along with something that we are supplying to a foreign military, particularly a military that is building capacity, learning to do the job, right? So DSCA is basically, this is going to sound kind of derogatory. It's not meant to be, kind of the arms merchant of the department. And so they do all foreign military sales, and that's their bread and butter. That's what they do. MODA is kind of the human element of that. So when we provide capabilities to developing countries and their militaries, and we're building defense capacity, MODAs are the people who are sent out to train the locals and advise them and assist them so that they learn how to do what they need to do themselves, not just with whatever capacities we're providing, but generally, like, how do you do this aspect of being a good military? What I was particularly leading in 2018 and 2019 was information and communications technologies. I was advising the Afghan army and the Afghan police on things like their radios and their networks and management of things inside of that context. What are the three things a soldier has to do? Move, shoot, and communicate. Communicate was my domain. I was privileged to lead that, and to work with our international partners in that mission to do things like improve their fiber optic network. And, I think we were doing good work, notwithstanding how it ended, which is a personal and painful topic to me.
Yeah.
But
I can imagine. And I've heard that. I was going to ask you, I've heard from, not personally, like podcasts and other things, people in media who served in Afghanistan, either in combat roles or advisory roles or anything else. And I've heard some of them make the opinion like the outcome that ended up happening, they claim they foresaw. Like they feel like there wasn't a realistic hope that the forces we were training and supporting were going to be able to hold ground after we left. Curious what your opinion is.
I mean, that's not just their opinion. That is the opinion of record. There's an organization called SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. That organization throughout the war repeatedly said, if there is a precipitous American withdrawal, this is what will happen. The only thing that ever varied in that assessment was how long it would take. And when it happened, we thought it would take a little longer than it did. We were all caught off guard. But we knew that is how that would play out. We absolutely knew it. So, and you couldn't come to any other conclusion in the face of the facts that they had access to.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, A number of things. Until very shortly before the end of the war. Let's go back a little bit. Sorry, this is going to be kind of a history lesson.
Let's go back.
Okay. Afghanistan was occupied by the Soviets during the 1980s, the late 70s and most of the 80s. During that time, what had happened was that Afghanistan was ruled by a king. The king actually did a lot to in his time to build the infrastructure of Afghanistan. There's this thing called the Ring Road, Highway 1, which runs all around the perimeter of Afghanistan, which is huge. To put Afghanistan in perspective, it is roughly the size and the population of Texas. So think of it as, as that. It's Texas, but it's Texas at the fulcrum of the Silk Road, right? If it existed there.
With mountains.
With mountains, yeah. Kabul is in the foothills of the Himalayas. It's at roughly 6,000 feet elevation. It was actually really hard going on leave and coming back because I lived at sea level at the time. So the Soviets became involved in Afghanistan because the king left the country and was deposed by a relative. And that relative instituted a communist government in Afghanistan. And that communist government actually asked for Soviet help. So the Russians didn't invade Afghanistan. Technically, they were invited. And they were there for about 10 years. And during that time, most of the senior leadership of anything important in Afghanistan was wrapped up in the apparatus of the Soviets trying to do exactly what I just described MODA doing, building capacity. They were trained by the Soviets. That generation of leaders, once they had power, were loath to give it up. And so there's a very apt example of this. When I arrived in 2018, my advisee, my counterpart at the Ministry of Interior Affairs, which is kind of like, it's their national police force, but it's also like their State Department. It's the people who issue passports and stuff like that. The guy who was the ICT Director General at the MOI, his name was General Rahimi. He was trained by the Soviets. He was well into his 60s, and he was definitely a murderer. Definitely. Like he had a crime ring that he ran, and he had definitely murdered some of his own people to keep that crime ring intact and avoid prosecution. We absolutely knew this about him. What do you do about that? Well, nothing. He's the ICT Director General. Like that's who they put in this position. So other people will have other answers. At the time when I was there, I would tell you that this thing called inherent law had not yet happened. Inherent law was a decree, a proclamation of forced retirement. And it was kind of brilliant, recognizing that there was a cancer that was at the top levels of the ministries and the Afghan government and the military and the police. The president basically said, look, if you're over a certain age or a certain number of years, you will be forced to retire. And what that did, bearing in mind at the point that was done, we had been in Afghanistan for the better part of 20 years. So the people who were in the wings waiting to take the place of the people who were actually in power at that moment, broadly were people who were trained by us, or at least people who came along after the time of the Soviets. The guy who fell in behind General Rahimi, when General Rahimi was forcibly retired, was a brigadier general who, I'm not saying his name, he's actually here. He's here in the United States now. But this person who took over that position of ICT Director General, to just draw the distinction between these two humans, we had a contract that was meant to provide radio repair, like radio maintenance for the Afghan police in, sort of a 3-tier American style maintenance system. That contract never really worked. I actually terminated the contract while I was there. And we were trying to figure out, how do we do this more organically? Like, how do we get the Afghan police to do it? The general I'm talking about, on his own, they had a whole stockpile of broken radios. He ordered some of his people to take like 20 of those radios out to a little shop out in Kabul and say, hey, can you fix this? And they did. Like 18 of them came back fixed at an average cost of less than 10 United States dollars per radio. So he said, okay, take 100. Grab 100 of those radios, take them back out to the same guys. Similar result. 70, 80 of them came back fixed. Average cost less than $20 per radio. The ministry had all the capability they needed, and they had capacity in the local economy, which had been built up over time. They had the basic ingredients. It took a generation to build those basic ingredients, but they were just starting to be unleashed. They were just starting to come into their own. The guys who had held power for so long had just retired or resigned. Yes, they had their criminal syndicates. Yes, they had, pilfered a lot of money out of the system, but they were gone. And the new generation of leaders that came in behind them did not identify as their tribe. They did not identify as their, fealty to a particular warlord or, to themselves. They identified as Afghans. They had a national identity for the first time. That was in the last 2 years of a 20-year evolution. Did it take too long? I don't know. It took us from 1776 to 1789 to go from declaring independence to writing a constitution. And would you say our constitution worked immediately out of the gate, right?
Yeah.
It
was tenuous until that first transition, maybe.
How long did it take to ratify? And yeah, the fact that George Washington stepped down after 2 terms rather than, as he was invited to do, declare himself king of America, it was the goodness of the people who were there that made the difference. I would tell you my personal opinion is, yes, there was waste, there was corruption, it was rampant in Afghanistan, but we were getting past it. And the people who made the decision to leave never bothered to understand what the real situation on the ground was. And even if they were told in their defense, even if they were told everything I just told you, they may not have believed it, and they may have been right not to, because they'd been told by generation after generation of military commanders and people who were at CSTICA, which is where I was, a Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan. The people who were there had constantly sort of said, we're at a turning point, we're at a turning point, we're at a turning point. We were at a turning point, and we pulled the rug out from under these people. And they just didn't have, they were at a time when they had unacceptable losses in the field. They'd had ghost soldiers over there that we had just finally gotten to the point where AFMIS and APS, these are 2 different systems that they used over there basically to pay everyone, guaranteed that a person receiving a paycheck was actually a person, like actually serving on duty. And so we had exposed that, and we had kind of figured it out. They just needed a little more time to shore themselves up to, better compete, fight, and win. And we precipitously withdrew. And what happened, what Cigar said would happen the whole time, is what happened.
Man, what a disservice then, if I understand people feeling like it was a quagmire. I totally understand the political motivation behind getting out of it. And I know it felt like the last decade, every presidential election, a key issue was, I'm going to get us out of Afghanistan.
Yep.
And it was just like, once they got in and learned, it seemed like the messaging softened on that, because either they were being told it's going to be way more difficult, or, hey, stick it out. There's potential. There's progress. There's hope.
Well, I think that what Congress would have told you at the time, because they kind of did, was that we were paying roughly a $5.5 billion a year insurance policy. Major combat operations on the part of U.S. forces in Afghanistan ended in 2014. We were still deploying people over there, but they were doing what I was doing. They were sitting alongside the Afghans, teaching them how to do what they were doing. We did have special forces in the country. They were doing their thing, right? And we were largely sort of the force behind the Afghan Air Force. And the Afghan Air Force and the Afghan Special Forces were really the best military capabilities that they had. So we were still kind of critical to their combat capability. But we were done deploying soldiers and Marines to fight in Afghanistan. And we'd been done with it for years. The American public doesn't know that. Your average person, if you ask them, would never have known that. We'd stop talking about it. It just, other than let's get out of Afghanistan, it wasn't even really a topic around a dinner table. And why would it be? There were so few people actually over there at that point. And the cost had dropped significantly. $5.5 billion in the context of the federal budget. What is that?
Right. A drop a day.
It's a drop in the bucket. Yeah. And I think people just didn't know how little we were spending. People didn't know the fact that really no one had died in combat in Afghanistan in years at the point where we withdrew. The Marines who died at Kaya, I was on Kaya. That's where I was. I have walked that road from that gate down to the hotel that's down that road where we would stage convoys. We had people who lived and worked there. Like I've been there. I've been exactly at that point where those people died. And they didn't have to die. They died because we chose to pull out. And the way that we pulled out led to the circumstances that led to their deaths. I stopped short of blaming particular individuals, but that it grates on me.
I'm sure.
As all this was happening, there was a period of like 2 weeks during this withdrawal when me and everybody like me did not sleep. We didn't sleep. We were answering communications in any way we could get them, mostly via like Facebook Messenger and, WhatsApp and or ways that Afghans communicate. But we were talking to the people that we knew who were being left behind and trying to find any way we could, building, informal networks of people to try and get people to a certain place to make sure that they could get onto the base and get onto a plane. And most of the people that I think legitimately are the people that we made a promise to in the 20 years that we spent in Afghanistan, that, if you stand by us, we'll stand by you. The people who raided an SIV, those are not the people who got out. The people who got out, broadly, are the people who got led into the airport. And the people who got led into the airport in the early days of the withdrawal, there were Afghan special forces still forming a barrier between the Taliban and U.S. forces on Kaya. And those special forces guys were the ones firing their rifles in the air and scaring people off in the first few days of the withdrawal, if you remember that.
Yeah.
The people who got onto the base were like their families. That's who got let out. And do those people deserve to live? Of course they do. Yeah. But they're not the people who, served as translators, who worked at the ministries, who put their lives.
Who would be targets of the new.
Who absolutely would be targets of the Taliban. I have sponsored 2 people for entry into the United States in my official capacity. I have officially requested, and both requests were honored, that U.S. Refugee Admissions Program admit 2 Afghans. One was the general I told you about earlier, who's now here. The other is a young man who worked for us, worked for the coalition through a program called the SME program, the Subject Matter Expert Program. We were hiring and training young people in technical disciplines to take over the jobs that were technical at the ministries. And this was a young man who we had hired to do, in his case, cybersecurity for the networks that the Ministry of Interior Affairs ran. On the day that the Taliban rolled into Kabul, unopposed, he was the acting director. Everyone had disappeared. He had been like the guy who ran the data center, but he fleeted up immediately because he was a civilian employee by then, he was a civilian employee of the ministry, and he was the senior guy left. So he was the acting director. He gave the order to sabotage the data center at the MOI. That data center housed apps and AFMIS. It housed the list of the database behind the Afghan passports, right? It not only had a list of everyone who'd ever been issued a national ID, it had a list of everyone who'd ever worked in any capacity for or with the coalition. If you'd wanted the name and family names and home addresses of everyone who'd ever served in the Afghan army, that was in a database in that data center. And he gave the order to scuttle it. And they did, in an unrecoverable way. And the next day, he went home, and he told his people to go home. The next day, the Taliban came to his house. I don't take that on faith. I've seen video of it. He shared video from a security system with me of the Taliban coming to his house. They came to his house because everyone told them that this guy was the guy who could put it all back. And they asked him to come back to work. And with an arrogance known only to the young, he said no. And that night, he and his family disappeared. His wife was pregnant. He's been on the run ever since, for 3 years, for longer, actually, at this point. And that child was born, and U.S. RAP actually, approved my request, which went through DOD at the time, to admit this person. And he was in the pipeline to be admitted when the current administration took over. And they shut all that down. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Afghans exactly like that young man and their families whose lives are directly at risk today because we shut all that down. And I'm heartened by the fact that there's legislation now in Congress, I think that's been tied now to the funding of the State Department for next year, the Enduring Welcome Act, and the Afghan Adjustment Act, I want to say is the other one, but there's legislation now to start those programs back up, get those people here. We made promises to these people. We need to keep those promises because these are not the last people in a war-torn part of the world who we will need to work with us. And if we can't keep our promises to them, no one's ever going to believe us again when we need something like that.
Don, I know we said the tradition here is banned on points of optimism. We talked a bit about that, but I do want to return to that.
Yeah.
I share your optimism in a time of challenge. And I think like you, I feel something of like a white blood cell as a person. Like I hone in on problems and that tends to be my focus, but I've recognized from my own mental health in a large way, it is good to reground myself in optimism and sort of like, why am I doing what I'm doing? We talked about the people, that serve the missions that you've been a part of as inspiration and source of that optimism. Anywhere else you draw on it?
Yeah. And it's, it is everyday people inspire me. If you see them in the right circumstances, they will inspire anyone. Simple acts of humanity and kindness inspire me. I was on a long planned vacation with my grandson at Disney World just a couple of weeks ago. And things that I found inspiring while we were there were like people getting up to give their spot on the bus to my daughter who's pregnant, so that she could sit. like little things like that.
Yeah.
People giving up their space so that you could fold up that stroller and tuck it away. My grandson, who's 2 years old, standing in line next to another 2-year-old, and they just immediately start hugging. I wish I had a video of this. They're talking. He's saying his name, the other 2-year-old saying their name, and they can
trying
sort
to
of
figure it out.
barely speak, but what do they do almost immediately? They're hugging each other.
Yeah.
That is who we are as human beings. It is our basic nature. We're social creatures. We need each other, and we're basically good. And if we can find a way to remember that and to listen to one another and look past the things that tend to divide us, we're going to be okay.
Listen, I can't end on a better note than that. So Don, truly appreciate you coming on. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you and hear all that, and a privilege. And so I thank you for sharing all that. I know a lot of it was personal, but I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.